Aurora Brown and intersectional psychology acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout South Africa and their connections to land, water, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Indigenous people listening today. Hello and welcome back to Intersectional Psychology, the podcast that explores psychology's role in promoting social justice. I'm your host, Aurora Brown. I'm a registered counsellor. I will be taking a break over the next 4 weeks, so the podcast will sort of also be on a break. Basically what I mean is that I won't be recording any new material over the next few weeks, but you will still be getting episodes in your podcast feed because I have created best of compilations of the seasons that we've covered this year on the podcast. So today is the best of season 1, which was titled Dissecting Intersectional Psychology. Basically, it is an introduction to intersectionality and social justice as they relate to mental health, and these clips come from all 4 episodes of season 1, so it's quite a comprehensive overview. I hope you have a fun and safe festive season. Whatever you're doing, whatever you're celebrating, I hope that you get to spend time with loved ones. Here in South Africa, we're just getting into summer, so if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, I hope you get to spend some time under a tree, in the shade. And if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, stay warm, look after yourself. You'll see my face again in January. Until then, enjoy the best ofs. Intersectionality in practice. So, how do we apply intersectionality in real-world psychology? Let's explore 3 areas: counselling, research, and education. Counselling. Imagine you're a counsellor working with a queer immigrant woman with a disability. Intersectionality asks you to see the whole person, not just their queerness, their immigrant status, or their disability, but how these identities interact to shape their experiences. Maybe this client faces barriers to accessing healthcare due to both ableism and xenophobia. Maybe she has trouble getting to a healthcare provider due to her disability. Maybe once she expended most of her energy to reach the clinic or the practice, the receptionist or the nursing staff treat her with disdain or carelessness because she is an immigrant. By the time she finally gets to see the doctor or the counselor, she has experienced even more trauma just in order to get help. Your role isn't just to provide individual support, but also to understand and challenge the systemic factors impacting her life. An intersectional approach also means examining your own biases. Are you unconsciously prioritizing certain aspects of a client's identity over others? For instance, focusing solely on their queerness might overlook how racism shapes their experiences, and hence their presenting complaint. Or how queerness is perceived in their particular culture. Second area, research. When looking at research, Elizabeth Cole's 3-question framework offers a practical guide for incorporating intersectionality into research. Her first question is, who is included within this category? When studying women, are you only including white, middle-class participants? And if you don't have access to women of other demographics, which is fine, if you don't have access, you don't have access, but are you at least considering what impact that is going to have on your research? Are you framing that in your research and in the conclusions and recommendations you make? Cole's second question is, what role does inequality play? How do systems like racism and sexism shape the experiences that you're studying? Her third question is, what similarities exist across categories? For example, what can we learn by comparing the parenting strategies of Black and brown families in addressing systemic racism? And I would add a fourth question. How are you treating the people included in your research? Are they your subjects? Or are they participants and co-creators of the research outcomes? As Crenshaw and Gzanka pointed out in 2014, without intersectionality, research risks perpetuating the very inequities it seeks to address. So, if it doesn't critique systems of power, it's not intersectionality. It's just diversity on autopilot, checking the boxes. Thirdly, education. In education, teaching intersectionality means moving beyond surface-level diversity training. It's about helping students and professionals understand both privilege and oppression. For example, a white, cisgender male psychology student might need to grapple with his own privilege and how it shapes his understanding of mental health. Conversely, a student from a marginalized background might need tools to navigate the systemic barriers they'll encounter in the field. Because even working in the healthcare sector, they might have a sexist boss or a racist colleague, or a transphobic job interviewer. Or they might end up working in a hospital that is adapted for wheelchair-using clients, but not disabled staff. I have actually been to a hospital in my wheelchair where my psychiatrist needed to come down and find a dingy, unused room for us to meet in because there was no wheelchair access to her office. Because whoever designed the hospital, literally the place that provides healthcare, couldn't conceive that a disabled person might need mental health care in addition to physical health care. I could get to the orthopedics and physiotherapy departments, but not to psychiatric and mental health care. And what if I, a wheelchair-using counselor, had gotten a job in that hospital? Where would they have put me? In the supply closets? Honey. And can you guess what would have avoided that major design flaw? Having an intersectional lens. But bringing it all back, the key here is nuance. Intersectionality isn't about guilt or blame. It's about awareness and action. Next, learn the importance of coalition building. Intersectionality isn't just about highlighting differences. It's about finding common ground. The reproductive justice movement is a great example. Founded by women of color, it unites diverse voices to address issues like abortion access, childcare, and systemic racism. Psychology can learn from this model by fostering coalitions that challenge systemic barriers. I recently attended a protest calling for the boycott, divestment, and sanctioning of Israel for the ongoing genocide in Gaza. The protest was organized by a diverse coalition of activist groups, including Palestine Solidarity Campaign, South African Jews for a Free Palestine, Healthcare Workers for Palestine, Queers for Palestine, Christians for Palestine, Cape Town Lesbians, and various local mosques. Many of these groups are very small, and there are even fewer members of these groups who would actually participate in a protest and go out and march in the sweltering heat of an African summer. But when we all came together, we formed a coalition of thousands of people, both in Cape Town and in Johannesburg. So today we're unpacking the critical role that social justice plays in mental health and in psychology. Why? Because, as the late Maya Angelou said, do your best until you know better. And then, when you know better, do better. And psychology, our flawed, beautiful discipline, knows better. It's a field where science meets humanity, where listening can transform lives, and where addressing inequality isn't optional, it's ethical. Social justice isn't just a buzzword for social media warriors. It's a belief, a conviction, that everyone deserves equal opportunities and fair distribution of societal benefits. Al-Madani and Post in 2023 defined advocacy as systemic change work. It's about speaking truth to power while understanding how trauma-informed care and cultural humility shape our attitudes to advocacy. It's self-awareness in action. Mallinckrodt and colleagues in 2014 beautifully framed social justice as ensuring full and equal participation for all groups, shaped by their needs. It's about making sure that everyone has access to safety, resources, and opportunities to thrive, physical and psychological safety included. It sounds like common sense, right? And yet, inequity remains baked into our systems. Andrews and colleagues in 2023 gave us what I like to call the Justice League of Social Justice. Different types of justice working together to save the world. Firstly, we have distributive justice. It's not about giving everyone the same size slice of the pie. It's about giving everyone a slice of the size that they need, making sure those who are starving get enough pie to survive and thrive. Remember our little image of people standing on boxes in the previous episode. Secondly, we have procedural justice. Decisions must be fair, transparent, and inclusive. No backroom deals, no silenced voices. Thirdly, participatory justice. Those most affected by oppression must be the loudest voices in the room when it comes to decisions that affect them. And fourthly, epistemic justice. We need to recognize the expertise that comes from lived experience of those who've lived through oppression. Lived experience isn't just valid, it's invaluable. So these definitions give us the roadmap, but the destination? That requires advocacy and action. So pretending systemic oppression doesn't exist is out of the question. Instead, we need to address it head on. Together, there's power in collective action. As Kozhan and Bluestein reminded us in 2018, it's not enough to study these concepts in ivory towers. We must apply them in counselling rooms, organizations, and public policy decisions. Practical advocacy. Alright, we've covered the theory. Now let's roll up our sleeves and talk about what this looks like in real life. Advocacy isn't just for marches or political rallies. It's deeply embedded in the day-to-day work of psychology professionals. Kozhan and Bluestein identified 3 levels of advocacy in 2018, and each plays a crucial role. Firstly, individual level advocacy. This is what happens in counseling rooms. It's connecting marginalized clients with resources, using culturally adapted interventions, and crafting treatment plans that acknowledge the impact of systemic oppression. Speaking of culturally adapted interventions, I heard a story during my training about a young black boy who was given an IQ test in South Africa many decades ago. And he really struggled to answer the questions because the context for them was so outside his frame of reference. For example, one question was, do you drink your tea out of a cup or a mug? And he had no idea how to answer that because he'd only ever drunk his tea out of a tin can. And so he scored very low on the IQ test. But many decades later, he became a university professor at Oxford. So simply adapting interventions to fit the context of the client can make a huge difference to the outcomes in assessments, in treatment planning, and to their real-world life circumstances and their future. The second level of advocacy is organizational level advocacy. Within workplaces, advocacy might mean pushing for policies that promote equity and inclusion. How diverse is your practice? How many practitioners of color do you have? How many queer professionals are there? Do you have any counselors with disabilities? When clients come in and see someone like themselves, or even someone outside of the norm, they're immediately going to feel that your practice is a safer place for them. Of course, they're going to feel more comfortable to be themselves and to talk about these issues. And you haven't even done any work yet. But organizational level advocacy also means speaking up when you see microaggressions or systemic bias playing out. Does your receptionist hide her bag or her phone when certain clients come in? What message is that sending to them if they see it? Do you turn on the air conditioning in your office out of habit? Are you being aware of the environmental impact that your practice is having? Because the climate also impacts our clients and their futures and their children's futures. Third is community level advocacy. This is the big picture stuff. Partnering with community organizers, advocating for public policies that address inequity, and amplifying marginalized voices in every way possible. Share persons of color on social media. Psychology's historical missteps. What we can learn from the past. Eaton and colleagues in 2021 affirmed that mental health practitioners have unquestionably contributed to positive social change efforts. For example, psychologists have contributed to socially transformative Supreme Court cases in the US, South Africa, and further. They've advocated for reproductive freedoms and developed paradigms for combating racism. But let's not sugarcoat it. Psychology has a problematic history. So let's drop the needle on the greatest hits of psychology's epic fails. In 2008, Prileltensky pointed out that mental health practitioners have at various points colluded in structural oppression by providing methods and justification for torture, discrimination, segregation, and violence. As an example, Helms in 2015 cites the UK's Sir Francis Galton, who was the founder of differential psychology and the eugenics movement. Sure, he may be dead, but he still holds his knighthood. Galton, the eugenicist, also created the framework for comparative intelligence and personality testing. This still forms the basis of psychometrics today. Yakushko in 2019 highlighted how the legacy of this continues to influence psychometrics and research practices today. And here in South Africa, we have the psychologist Hendrik Verwoerd, who is commonly regarded as the architect of apartheid. In fact, Verwoerd, who served as the 6th Prime Minister of South Africa from 1958 to 1966, was nicknamed the father of apartheid. He he used his training and experience in research and applied psychology to socially engineer the institutional racial segregation, white supremacy, and propaganda that formed the apartheid state. As described by his biographer Joyce in 1999, Verwoerd studied in the United States as a young man in 1927 and 1928. From the Jim Crow system of racial segregation in America, he learned the crucial role that environmental influences could have on the physical and psychological development, resilience, and morale of people. In 2011, Marx explained how Verwoerd's environmental approach differed from the eugenics of Hitler's Nazis, which believed that the white race was genetically superior to other races. Verwoerd, on the other hand, believed that access, or lack of access, to education, nutrition, safety, freedom, and community could make all the difference. Verwoerd used what he learned in the US to create apartheid, which subjugated non-white South Africans by separating families and breaking down their support structures, limiting their access to healthy food, providing them with inferior education and housing, limiting their access to health care, and instituting the pass laws that confined their freedom of movement. Adams and colleagues asserted in 2019 that psychological knowledge is routinely deployed in the interest of individuating, capitalist, and specifically neoliberal agendas that divert attention away from the role of macro-level structural dynamics in the production of human behavior. In the counseling room, we are often so focused on what's happening within the client and their circle, in other words, what Cavey in 2022 called the person as a system and the person in a system, but then we neglect the person or the system in context. Galton and Verwoerd's application of psychological principles to apartheid policies and eugenics remains a stark reminder of how psychology can be misused to entrench systemic inequality. The HPCSA's emphasis on ethical practice is in part a response to this legacy, aiming to prevent similar abuses in the future. But now this is happening again, with an ongoing genocide in Gaza being supported by academics, militaries, and politicians from the most privileged countries. And this genocide was enabled by the systematic oppression, segregation, and unequal rights experienced by Palestinians in the West Bank since 1967. That's 58 years. And elements of legal discrimination were instituted by Israel as early as 1948. Human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Israeli group B'Tselem have all used the term apartheid to describe Israel's military administration over millions of Palestinians who are denied citizenship, forced to carry differential passbooks, and face movement restrictions, land confiscations, blockades, forced displacement, and settlement expansion. Sound familiar? Hamas's massacre of 1,139 people at the Israeli festival on the 7th of October 2023 was a horrific and inexcusable terror attack. But Israel's subsequent killing of over 69,000 Palestinians including protected categories like women, children, journalists, medical or health workers, and humanitarian workers, is a disproportionate response of collective punishment and genocide. Jews have historically faced widespread anti-Semitic discrimination. And the State of Israel does not represent all Jewish people. Not all Jewish people support Israel's actions in Gaza. And Israel's actions in Gaza are actually making the world less safe for Jews, because it is spurring a rise in anti-Semitism. Israel is now using the blueprint for apartheid designed by psychologist Verwoerd and supported by the USA. Why did America vote in Donald Trump again? Why do you think Elon Musk has become so successful and popular in the US? Because the US was primed for their brand of self-serving prejudice. It is a country where the majority of people who voted last year were so racist and misogynistic that they would rather elect a president who is a convicted sex pest and fraudster, a xenophobic, alleged insurrectionist and traitor, instead of a black woman who is eminently more qualified and skilled for the position. Americans love to call it the oldest democracy in the world. But the USA has never been a democracy. Even after emancipation, most Americans of color were systematically prevented from voting before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, by which time the US had already colonized Puerto Rico. Although it is called a self-governing unincorporated territory, Puerto Ricans are subject to the US federal laws, yet they are not allowed to vote in US elections, and they have no voting representatives in the US Congress. The same applies to the US territories, also known as colonies, in American Samoa, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, and the US Virgin Islands. All of these colonies are severely underdeveloped in comparison with the mainland USA. And now, the reason I'm giving you this random geopolitical lesson is that Trump wants to colonize Gaza, subjugating yet another non-white population that has already been subject to the injustices of apartheid for decades. This system was developed by a South African psychologist, and health workers in Palestine have been specifically targeted by the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF. Yet, most South African healthcare providers have remained silent on this topic. Surely learning from the past, taking accountability, making amends for the historical harms caused by our profession, and protecting our colleagues in Palestine means standing in solidarity with them and speaking out against Israel's atrocities in Gaza, because it won't stay contained in the Middle East. Already, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia have increased around the world, because it is being normalized by those in power. Civil disobedience and systemic change. Flynn and colleagues in 2021 argued that civil disobedience, defined as intentional violation of policy or law in service of higher principles, is a legitimate form of psychological advocacy. Whether it's supporting Black Lives Matter protests or challenging anti-LGBTQIA+ legislation, psychologists have a role to play in societal transformation. Communities who face exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural domination, or violence have used civil disobedience to reorient society's moral parameters, contest entrenched power structures, and exact concessions in support of social justice against cis-heteropatriarchy. Cis-heteropatriarchy refers to intersecting normative systems that privilege and reinforce the power of cisgender, heterosexual, usually white, men through the exploitation and oppression of women and sexual and gender minorities. In South Africa, activism has been a cornerstone of social change. From the anti-apartheid movement to contemporary queer advocacy, civil disobedience has played a crucial role in challenging systemic injustices. The HPCSA's ethical guidelines support psychologists who engage in such efforts, provided they maintain professional boundaries, prioritize client well-being, and ensure that their interventions are informed by ethical best practices. These guidelines emphasize that advocacy, research, and policy engagement are integral to ethical psychological practice, particularly when addressing social determinants of mental health and structural inequalities. The South African Constitution, Chapter 2, the Bill of Rights, Section 17, states, "Everyone has the right, peacefully and unarmed, to assemble, to demonstrate, to picket, and to present petitions." Defenders of the status quo manufacture popular narratives concerning violence at contemporary protests. These narratives often frame the occasional destruction of property by protesters, for example smashing windows or graffiti, as unjust violence, while excusing or justifying violent and disproportionate state repression against those who dare challenge the status quo. For example, dousing protesters with pepper spray, shooting them with impact munitions, or worse, and overlooking the systemic violence that begets protest in the first place. For example, the police murders of Black people like George Floyd that spurred the Black Lives Matter movement. This construction vilifies actions that threaten the status quo as violent, while presenting comparatively more severe actions that enact, protect, and embolden systems of oppression as neutral or just. Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for study and analysis to avoid mistakes of the past when civil disobedience was employed on too small a scale and sustained too briefly. Modern consensus hails Dr. King as a paragon of justice and non-violent civil disobedience, and derides violent state responses to the 1960s civil rights movement. However, during King's lifetime, the US government and scornful public disapproved of his tactics, maligned him for property damage that sometimes accompanied protests, and levied violent repression against the movement under the guise of restoring law and order. Perhaps most salient in recent South African memory is the wanton rioting and looting of retailers in July 2021, in response to the imprisonment of former President Jacob Zuma. His daughter, MP Duduzile Zuma Zambudla, is currently on trial for terrorism charges on suspicion of inciting violence on social media during those riots. On an international scale, and perhaps a precursor and catalyst for the Zuma riots, is the extreme damage, physical harm, loss of life, and collective trauma of the January 6th US Capitol insurrection, allegedly incited by Donald Trump, on social media. Just 6 months before the Zuma riots. Perhaps the January 6th insurrection normalized such violence, which led to other riots like the Zuma riots in South Africa. This perspective draws a sharp distinction between insurrection, particularly violent insurrection, and civil disobedience on the basis of goals. Insurrection aims to overthrow a government, whereas civil disobedience aims to beget, albeit often radical, reforms. The socially constructed boundary between righteous civil disobedience and unjust violence is neither arbitrary nor consistent. In response to these factors, two dimensions that can guide mental health practitioners' conceptions of civil disobedience are contestation and communication. In other words, under what conditions or when do specific methods contest injustice? And to what extent or how do these methods communicate a desire or a vision for change? Civil disobedience that contests pathologization and dehumanization of trans identities can shift public consciousness to examine the inherent violence of limiting someone's ability to make informed decisions while discovering, understanding, and creating gender, thereby communicating a vision for change. That same civil disobedience simultaneously disrupts the commodification of informed decision-making and communicates to others that it is possible and necessary to continue disrupting. I encourage mental health practitioners to center these questions when considering civil disobedience. As South Africans, we have the constitutional right to protest, no matter what our profession. We cannot legally face professional penalties for protesting, as long as we obey the laws governing activism and do not bring our profession into disrepute. The empathetic, ethical, and empowered counselor. We've covered a lot, and if you're still here, thank you for sticking with this deep dive. This model of intersectional psychology, or any model that aims to fuse social justice with mental health, ultimately boils down to a simple principle. Treat people as whole human beings in their full context. Easy to say, challenging to do, but oh so worth it. When I first started on this journey of blending advocacy with counselling, I worried that I might lose my way as a counsellor. Would I become too much of an activist and forget the importance of just listening? But what I found was the opposite. The more I understood my clients' social worlds, the more meaningful my listening became. Clients could tell I wasn't listening to their inner psyche in a vacuum. I was hearing how the world weighs on them and joining them in holding that weight, even if just a little. That's incredibly powerful for forging a strong therapeutic bond. Being socially conscious is naturally going to make you outraged at times. There's so much injustice to be outraged about. Outrage is not usually the most helpful emotion in a counseling room, at least not if it's coming from the counselor. But using this model, I've learned how to channel my outrage into creative maladjustment, as Dr. Martin Luther King put it. For the practitioners listening, you got into this field to help people, and likely because you have a big heart. Intersectional psychology doesn't betray that mission. It fulfills it in a bigger way. It lets you help not just individual hearts and minds, but also chip away at the external problems that plague those hearts and minds. It's the difference between pulling someone out of the river versus going upstream to see why they fell in. We need lifeguards and bridge builders. On some days, you'll need to focus on saving one person from drowning in despair. On other days, you'll mend the broken bridge so fewer fall off. Both tasks are important, and both are healing. For general listeners or clients, what can you expect from an intersectional counselor? What can you ask for? Well, hopefully after this, you have a sense that you can expect more than just passive nodding. You should feel like your counselor sees you fully. If you mention something like experiencing racism, they won't skirt uncomfortably or change the topic. They'll acknowledge it and explore how it affects you. If you're struggling financially, they won't just say, how does that make you feel? They might actually help you strategize or find resources. If your identities are complex, they'll take the time to understand how you define them, and they'll celebrate those identities with you. In short, you'll know that all of you is welcome in the room. And if that's not the case with your current provider, it's absolutely okay to bring it up. I'd like if we could talk more about how X aspect of identity or X social issue is affecting me. A good counselor will respond openly to that. And if they don't, maybe slide them this podcast episode anonymously. But seriously, you deserve holistic care. For general listeners or clients, what can you expect from an intersectional counselor? What can you ask for? Well, hopefully after this, you have a sense that you can expect more than just passive nodding. You should feel like your counselor sees you fully. If you mention something like experiencing racism, they won't skirt uncomfortably or change the topic. They'll acknowledge it and explore how it affects you. If you're struggling financially, they won't just say, how does that make you feel? They might actually help you strategize or find resources. If your identities are complex, they'll take the time to understand how you define them, and they'll celebrate those identities with you. In short, you'll know that all of you is welcome in the room. And if that's not the case with your current provider, it's absolutely okay to bring it up. I'd like if we could talk more about how X aspect of identity or X social issue is affecting me. A good counselor will respond openly to that. And if they don't, maybe slide them this podcast episode anonymously. But seriously, you deserve holistic care. As counselors, we're responding to the times. It's an exciting time, frankly, to reimagine what psychology can be. Sometimes it feels like we're tearing down a wall between the counseling couch and the outside world, brick by brick. That can be scary. The outside world is chaotic, and counseling used to be a quiet little insulated room. But it can also be liberating. Now our room has windows and doors, fresh air can come in, and our work can go out. To wrap up, I want to leave you with a little story. You know I love metaphors and stories. Think of the starfish story. You've probably heard it, it's popular in social work circles. A person is on a beach littered with thousands of starfish that washed ashore. They're throwing them back into the sea, one by one. Someone comes and says, "Why bother? You can't save them all. What difference does it make?" And the person throws another starfish into the water and says, "It made a difference to that one." In counseling, each client is a starfish we're helping back into the ocean of life. Intersectional practice says, yes, keep tossing those starfish back one by one. And also ask, why the heck are so many starfish washing up here? Is there something wrong with the current? Pollution? Can we prevent this? Then start working on that angle too. It's not either or, it's both and. Help the ones in front of you, and whenever you can, try to fix the system that's stranding them. Thank you so much for listening. But if you have questions, reflections, or your own experiences with these ideas, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach out via your podcast app, on social media, via our website, or come join the conversation on the Matreon. Thank you for listening to Intersectional Psychology. Please follow or subscribe to the podcast to get every episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review Intersectional Psychology in your preferred app. It really helps other people find the podcast. This episode of Intersectional Psychology was researched, written, recorded, and edited by me, Aurora Brown. For a transcript of this episode, please see the link in the show notes on your podcast app or go to intersectionalpsychology.com. You can also check the website or the show notes for a full list of references for this episode. A video of this episode with closed captions is available on youtube.com/@intersectionalpsychology. To support this podcast and get access to bonus content, including additional episodes and interviews, as well as more guided mindfulness sessions, please go to patreon.com/intersectionalpsychology. You can also chat with me on Blue Sky at intersectpsych.bsky.social and Instagram, Facebook, or TikTok at Intersectional Psychology. But mostly Blue Sky. Aurora Brown and Intersectional Psychology are committed to the Cite Black Women praxis. All episodes of Intersectional Psychology are for educational purposes only and are not intended to be a substitute for professional mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. I, Aurora Brown, am not able to answer specific questions about individual situations. Always seek the advice of your health provider with any questions you may have regarding a mental health condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard or seen on this podcast. If you think you need immediate assistance, please call your local emergency number or any mental health crisis hotline. Everyone deserves good mental health.